Well, hello everybody. Usually I say thank you for invitation, but today I'll say thank you for coming and welcome to Belarus. Today I will talk about also continuing this topic of demographics, but I'll present a little bit less fundamental paper in which I'll talk about just one aspect, and this aspect is child adoption. So, as a motivation for this paper, I can actually just show you this graph, which represents child adoption rate in the United States. Today, we know that, for example, from social media, child adoption is fairly socially acceptable in the United States, and many, even movie stars, adopt children, so it even became a little bit trendy. Then it appears to be even more surprising that modern adoption rates are way lower than they used to be in around 1970s. So today, people adopt way less. This trend is what's called mu-shaped trend. First, we see this pretty much exponential increase in the child adoption rates in the United States until around 1970, and then this sharp drop, which continued until 1990s, and then only this slow recovery after that. So what I do in this project, well, basically I want to study this adoption market and find explanation of what happened with this historic adoption trends. Also, I will talk about United States, but this trend is actually common to many other developed nations. So, like, if you would look at Australia, the shape is very much similar. So in this paper, I will study demand and supply sides of adoption markets, and I'll make a special focus on the demand side for orphans for adoption. I build a stylized model where adoption will be an alternative to childbearing, and use this model to simulate these historic trends in the US adoptions. So first, before talking about adoption, I would like to introduce who are the adoptive mothers, who are the adoptive parents, and why do people adopt children. It appears that actually most of the people who adopt children in the United States, it looks like they are actually doing it as a substitute for their own fertility. Most of the adoptive mothers are well-educated women at age 30 or older who have tried to have their own children but failed to do so. Or it could be that they, for example, had several of their own children but wanted to have more, and then but were not able to have this more of their own children. So it looks like they use adoption as an alternative to the childbearing. So what are the main driving factors on the supply and demand side of this market for child adoption? We have this conventional wisdom, conventional explanation of what is going on this market, especially of what explains this drop after 1970. And this conventional explanation comes from the simple fact that in the early 1970s, abortions were legalized in the United States. So the conventional wisdom is that there simply were not enough children for adoption because there was decrease in number of orphans. So this change comes from the supply side. What I want to emphasize in this paper are two what I would argue major factors on the demand side. So first, how to explain this increase in number of adoptions before 1970. I explain it with increase in career opportunities for women. In returns for female experience motivated women to invest more in their careers, delay fertility, and as fecundity declines with age, it led to increase in demand for adoption. On the other hand, there was another major change in the early 1970s, and that change was a major breakthrough in ART technologies, or assisted reproductive technologies. They became widespread, actually coincidentally, at the same time as abortion was legalized. And, well, they were developed a little bit earlier, but became widespread again around early 1970s, which allowed for more of the older women to have biological children even at these older ages. So this is picture from this conventional wisdom, conventional explanation. Indeed, of course, as abortions were legalized, they soared, although, of course, we don't know the true numbers which were before 1970, because, of course, there were some illegal abortions, but we don't have any good official data, although we actually have some estimates which I'll use in my simulations. But why this just supply-side explanation is not enough? Why change in abortion laws, legalization of abortions is not enough to explain this historical trend? Well, there are several reasons. The first and the easiest one is that, well, abortion can explain this drop, or at least partly explain drop after 1970, but it, of course, cannot explain this rise which took place before the 1970, why this adoption rate was increasing. Another thing about limitation of this abortion explanation is that children, although we're talking about this market and goods, children are not our usual goods. So if we don't have oranges in the local store, we just don't eat oranges, that's it. But children are not like that. So for children, since they're so important, people go and look for them in other markets. If there are not enough children in the local market in the US, for example, there are international adoptions, and people often do go abroad and adopt children from abroad. So what would I expect to see if there was really just this supply side shortage? I would expect to see a kink in the trend of international adoption, so that these people who realized that there are not enough children for adoption in the United States, they just all of a sudden go abroad and adopt more from abroad. But we don't observe this kink in international adoptions. Well, another argument for that would be also maybe less of important argument, that if there is supply side shortage, another thing that I would expect to see is that it should be somehow reflected in the mean age at first birth of women. So maybe they would decide that they would delay fertility less if adoption option is not as available as it used to be. Now let's go to the supply side. That's wrong. So it's about demand side, actually. Demand side for adoption. And let me tell you just this brief history, main milestones in assisted reproductive technologies. So this is a picture of Dr. Jerome Sherman, who is the founder of first in the world sperm bank, and he did it in the University of Iowa, where I have graduated from, so this was like an Iowa slide of fame. So the main milestones are as follows. The first successful pregnancy coming from artificial insemination took place in 1953. In 1970, there was already the first commercial sperm bank in the United States. So the first sperm bank was in 1964, but by 1970 it was so widespread that there was even the first commercial sperm bank. Then assisted reproductive technologies developed further, and IVF came to the game. So there was first IVF child, and nowadays, of course, these operations related to art are widespread and very common in the United States. So this graph actually shows this success or progress of art technologies. This blue line is the probability of being fertile by any age for 1970s, in 1970s. So as you can see, after age 30, this probability of being fertile starts to decrease. But by 1990s, at some ages, this probability of being fertile at this age increased by sometimes 30% or even more. So that's a huge change in this age-specific fecundity. So what I do in the model? As I said, the model is rather stylized. I assume that an agent, it could be either single woman or married woman, so it doesn't matter. This agent lives from time 0, which is beginning of her career, to time R, when she retires. There is no uncertainty about that. Agent cares about her consumption and utility that she would receive from being a mother. So she chooses time t. It's time when she would like children to enter her life, when she would like to become a mother. And this K upper bar, which is this number of attempts to acquire a child. So this is like the maximum number of children that she would like to have in her life. She could end up with biological children and adopted children. All of them are assumed for simplicity to appear simultaneously in her life. As I said, this K upper bar is like the maximum number of children. Given those assumptions, what agent want to maximize is this utility of consumption or value of her lifetime earnings plus this expected utility of being a mother. I'll talk about both parts a little bit more. So first, let's talk about this family formation. At any age t, so if agent decides that she would like to become a mother at age big T, then I have age-specific probability of being fertile at this age. Of course, this probability of being fertile decreases with age. If agent fails to conceive, then she tries to adopt a child, and she's able to do it with probability pi a. So, for example, if she would like to have only this one attempt to become a mother, then she'll have a biological child with probability this pi b. She'll end up with one adopted child if she will fail to conceive, times probability that she will be successful in adopting a child, and with the complementary probability, she will be childless, so she will not have any children. So by choosing this timing of motherhood and K upper bar, agent specifically, implicitly chooses probability distribution over composition of her children. I also allow utility of being a mother to depend on this time that child is present in her life. So this retirement minus time when she becomes a mother. Why I do so? Well, otherwise it would be pretty hard to convince agent to have a child before age 30. As I have shown here, probability of being fertile pretty much stands constant until age 30. So then why anybody would have a child before age 30 if probabilities are all the same? So that's why I do such trick. I also allow probability, utility from biological children to be a little bit higher than utility from adopted children. So I multiply it by this coefficient lambda. This follows from, well, basically just reviewed preferences, since most people in real life do try to have biological children before adopting, so it looks like it's real preference that people draw more utility from biological children. Now let's go to the lifetime earnings. Following Olivetti, I assume this process of experience accumulation through learning by doing process. So current stock of experience depends on its past value and also on number of hours that agent worked in the previous period of her life. While the agent is childless, she would devote all her time to work, and once she becomes a mother, she needs to spend this predetermined fraction of time tau per child. So basically, there would be these two functions of her experience, one before she becomes a mother, which just depends on time t, and one after she becomes a mother, which would also depend on both number of children that she will have and this timing that she makes a break in her career, timing when she becomes a mother. With such experience accumulation process, this actually becomes important. So let me talk a little bit more about how this process works and how it's different from the standard approach, which is, like, let's call it a la Mincer approach. So in Mincer approach, experience accumulation rate does not depend on age. It only depends on number of years that agent worked. So if agent quits job at age 30 and makes this 10-year gap in work experience, then she starts with the same rate of experience accumulation as before, the same angle alpha. With this age-specific process, which I borrow from Olivetti, there are age-specific rates of experience accumulation. So basically, you can think that people learn faster when they're younger than when they're older. That's why we go to university when we're younger. So now there is additional benefit of fertility delay. This picture shows what happens to this experience when agent, the blue lines show when agent exits labor force for example, 10 years when she's 30 to 40, and green line is the same, but when she exits labor force when she's 35, and again for 10 years. So if she postpones her break in her career, she would be able to accumulate way more experience, and her lifetime earnings would be higher. So this brings these incentives for agents to delay fertility as far as possible, to delay this break in the career. So for simulation, well, unfortunately, data is not good enough for calibration. That's why I am doing simulation. I simulate behavior of successive generations of representative agents. All these generations are identical, except that they differ in three functions. First, they differ in returns to female experience as it increases for later generations. They differ in probability of adoption, of availability of adoption. So this would reflect changes in, for example, abortion rates. And they differ in age-specific probabilities of being fertile. This will reflect innovations in art, in assisted reproductive technologies. So for this, for experience accumulation process, I use linear extrapolation of coefficients obtained by Olivetti. For probability of being fertile, as a benchmark case, I use data from Van Noord Zaatstra, and then I update this benchmark profile with art success rates. And for availability of adoption, you should rather think about it as a measure of tightness of adoption markets. So how hard it is to get a child. And I'm not interested in the absolute level of adoption, but rather in change of this tightness of markets between generations. So in my simulation, it reflects number of legal and illegal abortions. There are some papers which estimate number of illegal abortions before the legalization from suspicious deaths of women in the United States. And I corrected for number of inter-country or international adoptions per thousand of live birth in the United States. So my basic simulation result looks as following. So it's this red line. As you can see, it actually is able to match the general shape. Sorry, what?
Is this targeted?
So I target adoption rates in 1950s. I choose utility parameters so that my red line would coincide with the data in 1950, and then I feed in change in these cohort-specific functions. So as you can see, my simulation actually is able to capture the general shape of historic trend pretty well. Of course, it has some limitations. It overestimates the spike level of adoptions and overestimates the drop. There is such a little bit weird kink. It's an artifact of representative agent starts to choose less children. So basically at this point, representative agent decides that she would like to have at maximum not 3 but 2 children, this K upper bar. But again, overall, so I assume that it's somewhat success in explaining the historic trend. I can also run several counterfactual experiments. So the first one would be, what if nothing happened except this increase in returns to female experience? Of course, as we would expect, women would delay fertility farther and farther, so demand for adoption will only grow and grow, and there would be nothing to prevent it, so like go to very huge numbers. Now I can combine increase in returns to experience and change in abortion rates. So we see that, yes, it indeed would change the shape of the trend, but still it would be not enough to counteract this motivation which comes from returns to experience, at least in my simulation. And in Counterfactual 3, I combine increase in returns to experience with developments in art. So here, all these changes will come just from the demand side. Returns to experience would motivate women to delay, but art technologies would allow them to have biological children even at these later ages of their lives. And as you can see, it actually, again, it produces this general qualitative shape. Yep.
Can you match this with like the model prediction of the number of IVF kids with data on IVF?
So this is about the general, so the answer to the question is no. And the reason is that art is not just IVF. So IVF is one of the methods of art, but it came later. So for even nowadays, IVF is less widely used operation than artificial insemination. Artificial insemination is actually #1 art method, even nowadays.
There's no data on general art usage, like how many kids are born using some sort of art over time?
So there is some limited data on that. So there is this art success rates which I use, and
you could also proxy for art by looking at the number of kids born to any age limit.
So for IVF, we know number of kids born due to IVF because IVF is very correlated with triplets. But for artificial insemination, we actually don't know.
But you could infer it by looking at the fraction of kids born to mothers of any given age in a year, right? So if you see that like the number of kids born to women age 37 increases dramatically from 1970 to 2000, then that's exactly getting at your
How to separate it from more women are trying to have a child after age 30? From probability that they are successful in that.
Okay, so yeah, you have a selection issue then.
Yes. So let's go back. I can look if my paper produces results, untargeted results in this age, mean age at first birth, and again, so this simulation actually captures this general trend in this average age of mother. And so it's time to conclude. Again, I argue that just this supply side changes, in particular legalization of abortion, is an unlikely unlikely thing that was driving the whole historical trend in child adoptions. And in the model, I show how mixture of female experience, how increase in returns to female experience produced this pre-1970s rise, and how combination of innovations in art together with increase in abortion rates produced this post-1970s decline. So, thank you very much. So you first and then questions?
Yep. Well, I'll have more questions than anything else, I think. This went high. I should say, I should probably stand next to the mic first. I should say that the views expressed here are not those of the Philadelphia Fed or the Federal Reserve System. And without any further ado, let's get into the paper. I'm going to make fun of the title later, so let's note that it's ART versus abortion. But let's get into the heart of it. It's kind of surprising we don't talk much more about it professionally, given how many people we know are going through IVFs and adoptions. So motivating the question is kind of, for a person my age, is very easy because I know a lot of people who have gone through this. But even in aggregate, on one hand, number of 3% might not seem large, though I think it is. So 3% is roughly the fraction of kids who have gone through adoption in the US. Now, if you think about higher income families, which admittedly is the pool I'm kind of interacting with the most, number goes up to 25%. So for well-off families, this is a very big deal. Affects many, many people. And what I didn't realize is that there's been this huge variation in the adoption rate. I simply didn't know it. I didn't see the mu shape in it. What I saw was a gigantic run-up and precipitous fall, and then pretty much flat after that. I understand it went up a little bit, went down. But what I'm going to concentrate on is what happened between 1950 and 1970, and then back down by 1985, it's down to 3%. So I think it's a fascinating question. And I'm more than happy to encourage any work to be done with it. So what's the basic? The title makes it sound like there are two competing stories, ART versus abortion. Well, the funny thing is those two actually work together, so they're certainly not versus. And those are, even his own slide had 3 forces on it, and there's really 4 in the model once you go to the quantitative exercise. So let's go through those very quickly. So first of all, what I'm going to call Mincer effect. Mincer is this stupid macro guy that Zvi was referring to. I know. I don't know why you attributed Mincer regression to macro people. We had nothing to do with it. All right, let's stop making fun of Mincer. It was truly a seminal contribution back in the day. You know, we were unsophisticated as a profession. So the basic idea is, and as Lev correctly pointed out, it's not really, I really shouldn't be calling it mincer. Mincer idea is, I mean, there is the quadratic term in mincer, that with experience you gain in wages. We call it human capital. What Lev emphasizes is it works, it's much more pronounced early in the career than later in the career. So we're going to just plug that in and say, look, the important thing is there's greater reward for staying in the labor market. There's greater attachment of women to the labor market. And that makes them want to postpone fertility, postpone childbearing. So that's going to be, what does it do? It increases, since postponing childbearing results in less successful childbearing, that increases demand for adoption. So that's the demand side story. Change in assisted reproduction technology, again, that's a demand side story, but that goes the other way. As older women are able to, technology allows them to successfully conceive with higher probability, that then decreases demand for adoption. And let me jump straight to what isn't numbered, what isn't kind of highlighted in Lev's presentation. There's also a rather significant change in female labor force participation altogether. So extensive margin that's not in the model but is in the data. And he does put it in the quantitative exercise. And it's non-trivial. Again, more women go into the labor force in the first place. That works kind of like, again, greater attachment to the labor force. So that's another demand story. Then there is a supply story. Supply story is as abortion gets legalized, more liberal, let's put it that way, abortion rate goes up, fewer kids presumably are available for adoption within the US. Now, the finding in the paper, that what Lev, I think, wants us to take away from it is, forget abortion, it's really all about demand side. So the paper shouldn't be called ART versus abortion, it should be called demand versus supply. And he comes off on the demand side of things. What's the key mechanism? The key mechanism is entirely, the entire thing is, it all is going to work through delay in fertility. Which, by the way, I think you should highlight more, and that gets at David's question as well. You do observe during this time delay in fertility. Age of mothers goes up, but also age of first birth goes up. So that is very much consistent with what we know. So let me now get at, I really have one key thing that bugs me, and that is the timing. Now, I don't quite understand the timing in the quantitative exercise. You kind of refer to it intermittently. In the introduction, it almost sounds like you're going to give me comparative statics. Once I get to quantitative exercise, it sounds more like you actually have done transitional dynamics, which would be vastly different. But then as you do transitional dynamics, do people foresee perfectly all of the changes in technology and abortion law as they're making their decision whether to go and work in the first place? Or are they like a sequence of what we call MIT shocks? It's like every period I couldn't foresee anybody changing reproductive technology, and then boom, it just arrives. And then next period again. So I don't know what happens there. So I'm going to kind of wing it and try to figure out if it makes sense to me. I'm also going to basically take it back to the period of just before your data starts, which I think is very important. So what am I trying to explain? What fascinates me about the motivating slide? There's a gigantic run-up between basically 1960 and 1970. So there's a gigantic run-up in adoption rates. So who are these women who are adopting? Again, it's all about women who are adopting, right? So who is adopting? As I said, I'm going to base it largely on my personal experience. These are 30 and 40-year-olds. So if they're 30s and 40s in 1960s, when did they make those decisions to go into the labor market and kind of get attached to the labor market? So I'm going, wait a second. Wouldn't that put them in 1940s and 50s? So in the there were some rather remarkable women labor market participation in the 1940s. And do I think that those were driven by men were kind of tied up in the war and women went to the factories? Or do I think that they were going, ART is going to change in 20 years. So that's where kind of the anticipation versus the fact that your changes to assisted reproductive technology and the changes to abortion rates, the ones that matter for decisions are forward-looking. And I'm thinking forward-looking some 20 years. Whereas the ART improvements, the effect is immediate. It's like, I made some decisions 20 years later, now I'm trying to have kids. Oh, there is new technology. Awesome. The effect is immediate. Right? So I think you want to really exploit the studying. You want to be a lot more explicit about it anyways. So I think it affects both the stories you're trying to push and the ones you're trying to dismiss. Because saying that, I think that timing does matter for dismissing abortion as well. That's really the main thing I have. This slide is mostly meant to poke fun of things. This is kind of, in a way, this is exact opposite of Zvi's paper. Zvi's paper had men. The only man on this paper is the author. It's there is no marriage, and hence, well, actually, just like in Zvi's paper, there is no change in cohabitation rates. I would like to see the labor force participation early on. Personal perspective. So these kids stay in mother with best I could tell, they stay with the mother and they're parasites. They just suck away her work time. And as a father of a 15-year-old, I'm so hoping he's going to move out soon. So now let's get a little bit more serious. Given my motivating slide, given why I find this fascinating, this 25% adoption rate amongst the richer portion of the population just begs for a model with heterogeneity. So this representative woman model, I'm not comfortable with it. I mean, I think this is begging for a model with meaningful heterogeneity and thinking about kind of, let me just leave it there. I think your targets start to change because it's not necessarily the aggregates that matter, it's doing it by income quintile, let's say, I think would be more informative. And then the other meaningful comment on the slide is, you refer to it as being a market for adoption, but the reason I would go to, I didn't find any GE effects, and they do want to treat it as a market, but you refer to tightness in this market. There is no tightness. You're kind of referring to, foster system never ran out of kids. There were always kids in the foster system. But two things about that. First of all, those are often older kids in the foster system. Those are not necessarily replacements for having my own baby. And I would love to see some data on that. So I actually don't know how much the market for newborns actually resembles a market. And then that's one. And then once I do go and start thinking about it as a market, I don't think we're going to run out of newborn kids to adopt, but we're very quickly going to run out of healthy newborn kids to adopt. And you're already getting at that in your own paper by saying, by the way, the difference in adopted kids are twice as likely to not be healthy as those that are not adopted. That tells you something. And to me, that says, wait a second, that's a G effect. It's like there's this margin of adjustment that's what clears the market, if you will. So that's the meaningful comments I had. There are a couple of slides of, let's call them dinky comments. What do I take away? So kind of what did I take away from this? I learned a new fascinating fact that adoption rate skyrocketed and just, not collapsed, but went pretty much right back down to 3% in the US. I think it's fascinating. Do I buy that demand was a major driver? Absolutely. I think you want to be careful about timing this. And am I going to blame World War II for the run-up? No. But I want to know I would be curious to know how much that attachment to the labor force might have. Anecdotally, there was like a meaningful push to get women out of the labor force in the 50s. Late 40s, to give men back their jobs. So that, I think, might be non-trivial. I really want to think of it, what you call human capital story. It's the labor force attachment story. And it's both through incentive to accumulate human capital and through the extensive margin. Yeah, I'm not quite ready to give up on abortion as a contributing factor, but I think it's a fascinating question to work on. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I think I'll start answering from the end, and hopefully I will not forget. So, yeah, of course, I'm not actually getting rid of abortion as an explanation factor, as I've shown you, so it contributes to the explanation, to the overall explanation of the historical trend. So yeah, the main point was rather, as you said, to show that demand side actually is more important, although it's not that it would produce all the changes. So more important doesn't mean that it's everything. Okay, now I forgot. So about the timing and perfect foresight. I don't use, so I basically tried both. Well, let's start with data. Unfortunately, we don't have a really good estimates of returns to female experience, for example, for 1940s and 1950s. At those times, unfortunately, well, people were not that, not many women worked, so researchers were not that interested in estimating these returns to female experience. And of course, there were like all the selection problems were huge and etc. So in this model, I tried different things. What I ended up doing is that women have perfect foresight of their this life cycle earnings, so of their earnings process, but don't have perfect foresight for abortion and changes in art. So I think this last version of simulation is when they kind of have foresight of couple years ahead about these things. So they can still adjust a little bit, but not perfectly. Well, which is reasonable because I guess it's reasonable or not. Well, that's like a stylist model. Now about heterogeneity in the model, yes, I indeed thought about it. I then decided for myself that rather than having heterogeneity, maybe I should think about this representative agent as just representative of this particular quantile of women. So maybe we should think about this representative agent as not an average woman in the United States, but average woman of age, well, from this top quantile. Because yes, most of adoptions happen there. Unfortunately, if I focus on women from the top quantile, then issues with data on, for example, their earnings becomes even worse. So there is this small slack in the paper, yes, which at least, meanwhile, I don't know how to overcome. Yes?
Actually, I would have a perfect, sound theory, maybe explanation why there was a spike and then, abrupt down. So there was a spike in adoptions, from the 50s, if I'm not mistaken, right, to up to the 70s, correct?
Yep.
I don't have this printed out presentation. So what was happening in the households back then? First of all, there's no data that would allow us to anticipate that the tax law was examined. So when exactly did we have a child credit in the United States? Something tells me that could be the legislation that changed on the income side. Because the direct child credit is a credit to the tax base, not just a decrease in the the taxable base, but it's a direct credit, which means who was given who was giving up the babies? Back then, there wasn't the opioid crisis, and there were perfectly healthy babies back then, and there were teenage girls, not necessarily of the bad families, but maybe good families, which means the higher incomers, women, were adopting the babies that were given by the lower incomers. There were basically redistribution of the babies, so to speak.
And this is still true.
Within the generation and wealth, выборка, я не помню как сказать. Okay, so basically what happened then abortions were legalized, so less and less, low-income families would give birth just to avoid, illegal abortions or whatnot. And at the same time, the artificial reproductive technology emerged. So higher incomers, higher earners could actually generate their own biological babies, and at the same time there was basically no babies in demand anymore, because lower incomers will go and have abortion. So we should look at the wealth distribution. We should look into the population, or based on what kind of women and how many were given birth and placing babies for adoption, and how many women and for what social distribution were actually accepting babies for adoption, and maybe they were the same babies.
Well, so I can say a couple of things about this. First, we cannot see who were placing babies for adoption. This is literally against the law, and literally, so people do not ask who brought this child into orphanage, and even if they would ask, they would never publish this data. So this we for sure don't know. Now, what about the things that you were talking, that it's basically redistribution of children from maybe presumably poor people to richer people? Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And about these forces and how this art allowed these wealthier women to have biological children, that's exactly, yes, what I am studying in this paper, so you're right.